Sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen when we least expect them. The choices we make in those fleeting seconds can change everything, not just for ourselves, but for complete strangers who desperately need our help. In 1847, Ezra Blackwood lived alone in his mountain cabin, far from civilization and content with his solitary life. When a young girl appeared at his door with her laboring mother, he had seconds to decide. The winter storm was getting worse. The nearest town was 50 miles away, and the woman was about to give birth. Ezra had spent 15 years avoiding the complications that people brought into his life. But in that moment, looking at the fear in the girl's eyes and hearing her mother's labored breathing, he realized that some situations don't give you the luxury of thinking twice. What happens when a man who chose isolation suddenly becomes someone's only hope for survival? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind had been howling for 3 days straight, carving through the mountain passes like the voice of an angry god. Ezra Blackwood stood at his small window, watching the snow pile against the glass in patterns that reminded him of home, a place he hadn't allowed himself to think about in years. The cabin creaked and settled around him, a familiar sound that had become his only companion through 15 winters of self-imposed exile. He was a man carved from the same harsh timber as the mountains themselves. Weathered hands bore the scars of countless repairs to his sanctuary, while his beard, now more silver than brown, spoke of years spent in contemplation rather than conversation. At 52, Ezra had found peace in the rhythm of survival, chopping wood, mending tools, hunting when the weather allowed, and reading by candlelight when it didn't. The cabin itself was a testament to his determination to remain apart from the world. Built into a natural clearing, surrounded by towering pines, it sat like a fortress of solitude. Every log had been carefully selected and fitted, every chink sealed against the brutal mountain winters. Inside, the space was sparse but functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by years of faithful service. A simple bed occupied one corner, while a rough-hewn table served for meals, and the occasional letter he never sent. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a small wooden cross, hand-carved with the kind of precision that comes from having too much time and too many memories. Ezra's eyes found it now, as they did most evenings when the loneliness felt particularly heavy. The cross represented everything he'd lost and everything he'd chosen to leave behind when he'd walked away from his old life. That old life seemed like it had belonged to someone else entirely. Captain Ezra Blackwood, Army surgeon, had served with distinction through some of the bloodiest battles of the war. He'd saved hundreds of lives, lost count of the limbs he'd amputated, and learned that death was often kinder than the alternatives. But it wasn't the war that had broken him. It was what waited for him when he returned home. Margaret and little Thomas had been gone for 2 months by the time he'd made it back to Virginia. Cholera had swept through their small town like wildfire, and his medical training, all his knowledge and skill, had been useless because he hadn't been there when they needed him most. The neighbors had buried them side by side in the town cemetery, and Ezra had stood over their graves, knowing that he could never again pretend to be the man who could save everyone. So he'd sold everything, taken what little he needed, and headed west until he found a place so remote that he wouldn't have to watch anyone else die. The mountains had welcomed his exile, offering him the kind of silence that could muffle even the loudest regrets. A sudden pounding on his door shattered the evening's contemplation. The sound was desperate, urgent, cutting through the wind's howl like a cry for help. Ezra's hand instinctively went to the rifle mounted above the fireplace, but something in the rhythm of the knocking made him pause. This wasn't the measured rap of a traveler seeking shelter. This was panic made audible. He moved to the door, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Through the thick planks he could hear voices, high, strained, frightened, a young voice barely more than a child, pleading with words he couldn't quite make out over the storm. Then came another sound that made his blood run cold, the deep, guttural moan of a woman in severe distress. Ezra's hand hesitated on the wooden bar that secured his door. For 15 years, this barrier had protected him from the complications that came with caring about other people. Behind this door lay his carefully constructed peace, his refuge from a world that took away everything he loved. But on the other side was something that called to the part of him he'd tried so hard to bury. The healer, the protector, the man who'd once sworn an oath to do no harm. The pounding came again, more frantic now, and with it came the voice of a young girl, clear despite the storm. "Please, sir, my mother, she's having her baby and we got nowhere else to go. Please!" The words hit him like a physical blow. A baby, a woman in labor caught in a blizzard with nowhere to turn. Every instinct he'd spent 15 years suppressing roared to life, and suddenly his hand was moving the bar aside, his body making the decision his mind was still wrestling with. He pulled the door open, and the winter night rushed in like an unwelcome guest, bringing with it snow, wind, and the sight that would change everything. A girl, no more than 13, stood on his threshold supporting a woman who could barely stand. The woman's face was twisted in pain, her breathing labored and desperate. Snow clung to both of them like a shroud, and the girl's eyes held the kind of terror that comes from watching someone you love slip away. "Please," the girl whispered again, her voice breaking. "Can my mother give birth in your cabin?" The woman, Mary, he would learn later, looked up at him through eyes glazed with exhaustion and pain. She was younger than he'd first thought, probably not yet 30, with auburn hair plastered to her head by melting snow. Her condition was obvious, even through the heavy coat that someone had wrapped around her. She was far along in labor, and from the way she was breathing, the baby wasn't going to wait for better circumstances. "Get in," Ezra said, the words coming from some deep place he'd thought was dead. "Both of you, get inside now." He helped them through the doorway, feeling the solid weight of the woman as she leaned against him. The girl, Sarah, she told him breathlessly, moved with the kind of desperate efficiency that spoke of someone who'd been caring for her mother for far too long. As soon as they were inside, Ezra barred the door again, shutting out the wind and snow. But knowing he'd just let something far more dangerous into his sanctuary, the possibility that he might care again. The woman collapsed into the chair by the fireplace, her breathing coming in short, sharp gasps. Between contractions, she managed to look around the cabin with the kind of gratitude that spoke of true desperation. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm Mary Sullivan, and this is my daughter Sarah. We've been traveling for days, and when the storm hit..." Her words were cut off by another contraction stronger than the last, and Ezra felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like an old coat. He looked at Sarah, seeing his own fear reflected in her young face, and realized that his 15 years of carefully maintained solitude were about to be tested in ways he'd never imagined. The wooden cross on the mantel seemed to watch as he knelt beside Mary's chair, his hands already moving to assess her condition with the skill of a man who'd delivered babies in field hospitals while cannon fire shook the ground. Some knowledge, it seemed, never truly faded. It just waited for the moment when it would be needed again. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, 3 strangers were about to become something more than that. Ezra just didn't know it yet. Mary's scream pierced the cabin's warmth like a blade, sharp and primal in a way that made Ezra's hands shake as he reached for the oil lamp. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, her young face pale with terror as her mother doubled over. In the wooden chair, gripping its arms so tightly, her knuckles went white. "How long has she been like this?" Ezra asked, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting in his carefully ordered world. He moved with purpose now, lighting additional lamps and candles until the cabin glowed with warm light that revealed just how dire Mary's condition truly was. "Since yesterday morning," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over her mother's labored breathing. "But it got real bad when the storm hit. She kept saying we had to find shelter, had to find help, but there was nowhere." Her words dissolved into tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand, trying to be strong for her mother's sake. Ezra knelt beside Mary's chair, his trained eye taking in details that painted a grim picture. Her face was flushed with fever, sweat beading despite the cold she'd just escaped. The way she held herself, the rhythm of her breathing, the glassy look in her eyes. He'd seen it all before in field hospitals, where women had labored too long without proper care. "Mary," he said gently, waiting for her eyes to focus on his face. "I need to help you, but first I need to know, how many children have you had before this one?" "Just Sarah," she gasped between contractions. 13 years ago. This one feels different. Wrong somehow." Her hand found his arm with surprising strength. "You're not going to let us die, are you?" "Sarah needs someone to take care of her. Nobody's dying in my cabin tonight," Ezra said firmly, though he wasn't certain he could keep that promise. He stood and moved to Sarah, placing gentle hands on her thin shoulders. "I need you to be brave now, understand? Your mother needs both of us to help her, and I can't do it alone." Sarah nodded, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "What do you need me to do?" "First, I need you to tell me about this." Ezra had noticed the simple gold band on Mary's finger, worn thin by years of wear. It caught the lamplight as her hands clenched and unclenched with each wave of pain. "Where's your father, Sarah?" The girl's face clouded over, and she glanced quickly at her mother before answering. "He's gone ahead to Oregon. We were supposed to meet him in Portland come spring, but..." She hesitated, as if there was more to the story she wasn't ready to share. "Mama said we had to leave earlier than planned. Said it wasn't safe to stay in Missouri anymore." Mary's eyes shot open at her daughter's words, and Ezra caught a look of warning pass between mother and child. There were secrets here, layers of truth that would have to wait for another time. Right now, the only thing that mattered was the life struggling to enter the world. Another contraction seized Mary, stronger than the last, and this time it was accompanied by a low moan that spoke of true distress. Ezra moved quickly, gathering what supplies he could from his modest stores: clean cloth, his sharpest knife, a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for medicinal purposes. His movements were economical, practiced, calling on skills he'd hoped never to use again. "Sarah, I need you to help me move your mother to the bed," he said. "She can't have this baby sitting in a chair." Together they managed to get Mary across the small cabin, though each step was an ordeal that left her gasping. As they settled her on Ezra's simple bed, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold, a dark stain spreading across the back of Mary's dress. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I need you to boil water. Lots of it. There's a kettle by the fireplace and a pot in the corner. Can you do that for me?" The girl nodded and hurried away, giving Ezra the privacy he needed to assess Mary's condition more thoroughly. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The baby was coming, ready or not, and there were complications that could kill both mother and child if he wasn't careful. "Mary," he said softly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Have you been bleeding? Before tonight, I mean." Her eyes found his wide with fear. "A little. Started about a week ago. I thought it was normal, but..." Another contraction cut off her words, and this time Ezra could see the baby's head beginning to crown. "Listen to me," he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd used in field hospitals when death was stalking the operating table. "This baby is coming now, whether we're ready or not. I need you to trust me, and I need you to fight. Your daughter needs her mother, do you understand?" Mary nodded, gripping his hand with desperate strength. Across the cabin, Sarah worked with the focused intensity of someone far older than her years, feeding wood to the fire and setting water to boil. The wedding ring on Mary's finger caught the light again, and Ezra found himself wondering about the man who'd put it there, the father who'd gone ahead to Oregon, leaving his wife and daughter to face this journey alone. There was something in Sarah's earlier hesitation, something in the way Mary had warned her with that look. that suggested their story wasn't as simple as a family separated by circumstances. But those were questions for later. Right now, there was only the immediate crisis: a woman in difficult labor, a baby determined to be born, and a man who'd spent 15 years trying to forget he'd ever cared about saving lives. The wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, rattling the shutters and sending snow spiraling down the chimney to hiss against the flames. Inside, the small space had become its own world, lit by lamplight and filled with the sounds of struggle: Mary's labored breathing, Sarah's quiet movements as she prepared supplies, and underneath it all, the steady rhythm of Ezra's voice as he guided them through the most dangerous night of their lives. "The water's ready," Sarah announced, her voice steady, despite the tears that streaked her cheeks. "Good girl," Ezra said, washing his hands in the scalding water before turning back to Mary. "Now, Mary, with the next contraction, I need you to push. Can you do that for me?" She nodded, her face set with determination that reminded him of soldiers facing impossible odds. The contraction came like a wave, and Mary bore down with everything she had, her cry echoing off the cabin walls while Sarah held her hand and whispered words of encouragement. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, 3 lives hung in the balance as the night stretched toward an uncertain dawn. As Mary's cries filled the cabin, Ezra realized his makeshift medical supplies wouldn't be enough. The bleeding was getting worse, and the baby seemed to be stuck in a dangerous position. He needed proper instruments, the kind he hadn't touched in 15 years. "Sarah," he called softly, not wanting to alarm her mother, "I need you to go to the corner there, behind that stack of firewood. There's a loose floorboard. Can you pry it up for me?" The girl looked puzzled, but did as he asked, her small fingers finding the edge of the board he'd indicated. It came up with a groan of protest, revealing a hollow space beneath. Sarah gasped at what she found there: a leather medical bag, old but well-maintained, filled with instruments that gleamed dully in the lamplight. "Bring it here," Ezra said, his voice tight with memories he'd tried to bury. The bag felt heavy in his hands, weighted with more than just metal instruments. Each tool inside represented lives he'd saved and lives he'd lost. Decisions made in the chaos of battlefield. Medicine, where seconds could mean the difference between a soldier going home or going to a grave. Sarah stared at the surgical instruments as he laid them out on a clean cloth. "You're a doctor," she whispered, and it wasn't a question. "Was," he corrected, selecting a pair of forceps with the care of a man choosing his own fate. Long time ago, Mary's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The baby's shoulder was caught behind her pelvic bone, a dangerous situation that required immediate intervention. Ezra's hands moved with muscle memory that 15 years of isolation couldn't erase, guiding the forceps with the precision of a man who'd performed this procedure dozens of times under far worse conditions. "Talk to her," he instructed Sarah. "Keep her calm. Tell her about Oregon, about meeting your father. Give her something to hold on to." As Sarah whispered stories of their planned reunion, Ezra worked with the focused intensity that had once made him one of the Army's most respected field surgeons. The baby was alive. He could feel the strong heartbeat as he carefully maneuvered the tiny body into position. But Mary was losing too much blood, her face growing paler with each passing minute. "Almost there," he murmured, more to himself than to his patients. With infinite care, he guided the baby's shoulders free, and suddenly the child slipped into the world in a rush of blood and fluid. A boy, tiny but perfectly formed, his first cry surprisingly strong for someone who'd fought so hard to be born. Sarah gasped in wonder, her eyes wide as she watched Ezra clear the baby's airway and wrap him in the cleanest cloth he could find. Will he be all right?" "He's small, but he's breathing well," Ezra said, placing the infant on his mother's chest. Mary's eyes fluttered open at the baby's touch, and despite her weakness, she managed a tired smile. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm your mama," but Ezra's relief was short-lived. The bleeding wasn't stopping, and Mary's pulse was growing weaker. He'd delivered the baby successfully, but the mother's life still hung in the balance. His hands worked quickly, pressing clean cloths against the bleeding, while his mind raced through possibilities. Treatments, anything that might save her, Sarah, he said quietly. I need you to hold pressure here while I prepare something. He guided her small hands to the cloths, showing her how to apply steady pressure without being too rough. Your mother is very tired, but she's strong. She just needs time to rest. As Sarah took over the immediate care, Ezra moved to prepare a mixture of herbs and whiskey that might help slow the bleeding. His movements were automatic, calling on knowledge that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. This was who he'd been before grief had driven him into the mountains, a healer, a man who fought death with everything he had. The baby fussed against his mother's chest, and Mary's hand came up weakly to stroke his tiny head. What should we call him? She asked Sarah, her voice growing stronger with each word. I don't know, Sarah admitted. Papa said he had a name picked out, but he never told us what it was. Ezra paused in his preparations, struck by something in the girl's tone. There it was again, that hesitation when she mentioned her father, as if there were things about him she wasn't sure she should say. He filed the observation away for later. Right now, Mary needed his full attention. The bleeding was finally beginning to slow, thanks to the pressure and the herbal mixture he'd given her. Color was returning to her cheeks, and her breathing was becoming more regular. The immediate crisis was passing, but Ezra knew they weren't out of danger yet. The next few hours would be critical. You did good, he told Sarah, helping her clean her hands in the warm water. Your mother's lucky to have a daughter who can keep her head in a crisis. Sarah looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her face. Are you going to help us get to Oregon? To find my papa? The question caught Ezra off guard. For 15 years, his world had been the size of this cabin and the few square miles around it. The idea of leaving, of traveling with this makeshift family into an uncertain future, was both terrifying and strangely appealing. Let's focus on getting your mother well first, he said carefully. Then we'll talk about what comes next. As if summoned by his words, Mary's eyes opened fully for the first time since the birth. She looked around the cabin, taking in the medical instruments. The careful way Ezra had arranged everything for maximum efficiency. The gentle competence with which he'd handled both her and the baby. You saved us, she said simply. Both of us, Ezra nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. He'd saved them, yes, but in doing so, he'd also saved something in himself, something he'd thought was lost forever in a cemetery in Virginia. The capacity to care, to fight for someone else's life, to be more than just a man hiding from his own pain. The storm outside was beginning to weaken, the wind's howl softening to a whisper. Dawn was still hours away, but already the cabin felt different, no longer a refuge from the world, but a place where new life had begun, and where three strangers were becoming something like a family. The hours before dawn passed slowly, marked by the baby's soft breathing and Mary's gradual recovery. Ezra found himself moving through his cabin with a strange sense of purpose, checking on his patients, adjusting blankets, making sure the fire stayed strong. It was the first time in 15 years that he'd felt truly needed, and the sensation was both comforting and unsettling. Sarah had curled up in the chair by the fireplace, exhausted from the night's ordeal, but reluctant to let her mother and brother out of her sight. As the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the shutters, she stirred and rubbed her eyes, looking around as if surprised to find herself in the mountain cabin. "How are they?" she asked quietly, nodding toward the bed where Mary slept with the baby nestled against her side. "Better," Ezra replied, poking at the fire with an iron rod. "Your mother's strong. She'll recover, given time." As he worked, Sarah's attention was drawn to something half-hidden beneath a stack of old newspapers on a shelf near the window. Curious, she reached for it, her fingers closing around a small wooden object. When she pulled it free, she found herself holding a toy soldier, carved with the same careful precision as the cross on the mantel. "What's this?" she asked, turning the figurine over in her hands. The soldier was dressed in a Union uniform, complete with tiny brass buttons and a miniature rifle. Despite its age, it had been lovingly maintained, the wood polished smooth by countless handlings. Ezra froze when he saw what she held, his face going pale in the lamplight. For a moment he seemed unable to speak, his eyes fixed on the toy with an expression of such profound loss that Sarah immediately regretted her curiosity. "I'm sorry," she whispered, moving to put it back. "I didn't mean to—" "No," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "It's all right. That belonged to my son, Thomas." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeing scenes from another life. "I carved it for his 4th birthday. He wanted to be a soldier like his papa." Sarah looked down at the toy, understanding now why it had been hidden away. "What happened to him?" "Cholera," Ezra said simply. "Took him and his mother while I was off playing war, thinking I was saving the world." He turned from the fire to face her, and Sarah saw tears in his eyes. "I was a fool, you know. Thought my duty was to the army, to the country. Never realized my real duty was to them, to be there when they needed me most." The weight of his confession hung in the air between them, heavy with years of accumulated guilt and regret. Sarah turned the wooden soldier over in her hands, feeling the love that had gone into its creation, the careful attention to detail that spoke of a father's devotion. "He would have been proud of you last night," she said quietly. "What you did for us. That took courage." Ezra looked at her with surprise, as if he'd forgotten that courage could take forms other than charging into battle. "Your mother did the hard part. I just helped a little. You saved our lives," Sarah insisted. "Both of us. And maybe that's what Thomas would have wanted. For you to help people when they needed it." From the bed came a soft stirring, and they both turned to see Mary's eyes open. The baby was awake too, making small, contented sounds as he nuzzled against his mother's warmth. Colour had returned to Mary's cheeks, and though she was still weak, she looked far better than she had during the crisis of the night before. "How do you feel?" Ezra asked, moving to check her pulse and temperature. "Like I've been trampled by a dozen horses," Mary replied with a weak smile. "But alive thanks to you." She looked down at her son, her expression softening. "He's beautiful, isn't he?" Sarah nodded, still holding the wooden soldier. "What are we going to name him?" Mary was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then her eyes found Ezra's face, studying the man who'd given them shelter and saved their lives. "I'd like to name him Ezra," she said, "after the man who brought him into the world." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. To have a child named after him, to have that kind of honor bestowed by virtual strangers, it was more than he felt he deserved. "Mary, that's not necessary. Your husband might have other ideas." Something flickered across Mary's face at the mention of her husband, a shadow that darkened her features for just a moment before she composed herself. "My husband isn't here," she said firmly. "You are. You're the one who risked everything to help us, and you're the one this child will owe his life to." Sarah looked between them, still clutching the toy soldier. "I think little Ezra is a perfect name," she said. "And maybe this could be his first toy." She held up the wooden figure. "If that's all right with you." Ezra stared at the soldier in her hands, seeing not just a remnant of his past, but a bridge to a possible future. To give Thomas's toy to this new child, this boy who bore his name, it felt like a passing of torches, a way to honor both the son he'd lost and the family he'd found. "I'd be honored," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As Sarah placed the wooden soldier in the baby's tiny hand, Ezra felt something shift inside him, like ice breaking up after a long winter. The guilt and grief that had driven him to the mountains were still there, but they no longer seemed like walls keeping him imprisoned. Instead, they felt like foundations on which he might build something new. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. But inside the cabin, the real transformation was just beginning. 3 strangers becoming a family. Bound together by circumstances and choice in equal measure, the baby gurgled softly, his fingers closing around the toy soldier with surprising strength. And for the first time in 15 years, Ezra Blackwood allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance at happiness. 3 days passed in a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar to Ezra. The cabin that had been his solitary refuge now hummed with the sounds of family life. Mary's gentle lullabies to little Ezra. Sarah's quiet questions about everything from cooking to the medicinal properties of mountain herbs. And the baby's contented sighs as he slept. It was a symphony Ezra had thought he'd never hear again on the 4th morning, while Mary dozed and the baby rested peacefully. Sarah was helping Ezra organize his medical supplies when her elbow knocked over a small wooden box that had been tucked behind the larger instruments. The box tumbled to the floor, spilling its contents across the rough planks, letters tied with faded ribbon, a few old photographs, and a leather-bound journal with worn edges. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, scrambling to collect the scattered items. But as she reached for the journal, it fell open to a page covered with Ezra's careful handwriting. Unable to help herself, she read a few lines before stopping, her cheeks burning with embarrassment at the invasion of privacy. Ezra noticed her stillness and looked over to see what had captured her attention. When he saw the open journal, his face went pale, but instead of anger, his expression held only resignation. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "Read it. Maybe it's time someone knew the truth about what kind of man I really am." Sarah looked up at him uncertainly. "I shouldn't. It's private." "Privacy is a luxury for people who have something worth hiding," Ezra replied, settling into his chair by the fire. "I'm done hiding." With hesitant fingers, Sarah turned back to the page she'd accidentally opened. The entry was dated nearly 2 years earlier, and the handwriting spoke of a man wrestling with demons in the darkness of his isolation. Another winter night, another conversation with ghosts. "Sometimes I think I hear Thomas laughing outside my window, but it's just the wind playing tricks on a lonely old fool. Margaret used to say that guilt was just love with nowhere to go. If that's true, then I'm drowning in love, choking on it, buried alive by the weight of all the words I never said and all the moments I let slip away while I was busy saving strangers." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she continued reading. The journal chronicled day after day of solitude, of a man punishing himself for sins both real and imagined. There were entries about nightmares, about waking up thinking he heard a baby crying, only to remember that his son would never cry again. There were passages about watching the seasons change and wondering if anyone would notice, if he simply disappeared into the mountains forever. "You've been so lonely," she whispered, looking up at him with compassion far beyond her years. "Loneliness was the point," Ezra replied. "I figured if I hurt enough, maybe it would balance the scales somehow. Maybe it would bring them back, or at least make their deaths mean something." Mary stirred on the bed, awakening to the sound of their voices. She took in the scene, Sarah holding the journal, Ezra's haunted expression, the weight of shared secrets hanging in the air, and seemed to understand without explanation. "We all carry ghosts," she said softly, adjusting baby Ezra's blanket. "Some of us just carry them louder than others." Sarah closed the journal carefully and placed it back in the wooden box. "Is that why you stayed up here? To punish yourself?" "At first," Ezra admitted. "But after a while, it just became easier than trying to live in a world where people expected me to be whole again. Up here, nobody expected anything from me. Nobody could disappoint me, and I couldn't disappoint them." "But you're not disappointing us," Sarah said earnestly. "You saved us. You've taken care of us. You've been—" She paused, searching for the right words. "You've been like a father." The words hung in the air like a benediction, and Ezra felt something crack open inside his chest. For 15 years, he'd believed that his capacity for fatherhood had died with Thomas, buried in that small grave in Virginia. But looking at Sarah's earnest face, feeling the trust she'd placed in him so readily, he began to wonder if maybe he'd been wrong. "Your real father," he said carefully. "Tell me about him. What's he like?" Sarah's expression grew complicated, and she glanced quickly at her mother before answering. "He's complicated. Strong, I guess, determined. When he sets his mind to something, he doesn't let anything stop him. He must love you very much to have gone ahead to Oregon, to prepare a place for you. Again that look passed between mother and daughter, laden with secrets and unspoken truths. Mary shifted uncomfortably on the bed, and when she spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "Love takes many forms," she said. "Sometimes the people we love make choices that are hard to understand. Sometimes they do things that seem wrong to others, but feel necessary to them." Ezra sensed there was much more to the story, had sensed it from the moment they'd appeared at his door, but he didn't press. Everyone was entitled to their secrets, especially people who'd been desperate enough to travel through a blizzard with a woman in labor. Instead, he reached for the box that contained his journal and pulled out one of the photographs Sarah had spilled. It showed a younger version of himself, standing beside a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Between them stood a little boy with Ezra's dark hair and his mother's sweet expression. "This was my family," he said, handing the photograph to Sarah. "Margaret and Thomas. She was a teacher before we married, and Thomas wanted to be everything. A soldier, a doctor, a mountain man, a farmer. He used to say he was going to do all the jobs in the world before he grew up." Sarah studied the photograph with the reverence it deserved. "They look happy." "We were," Ezra said simply. "For a while we were the happiest people in the world." Baby Ezra chose that moment to wake up, his small fist working free of his blanket as he made the soft, demanding sounds of hunger. Mary gathered him to her breast, and the cabin filled with the peaceful sounds of a child being nourished and loved. Watching them, Ezra felt the last of his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. These people, this makeshift family that had stumbled into his life during a storm, were teaching him something he'd forgotten in 15 years of self-imposed exile. That healing wasn't something you did in isolation. It was something that happened when you let yourself be needed again. When you chose to care despite the risk of loss. The journal in the wooden box contained hundreds of entries, chronicling his journey through grief and guilt. But perhaps it was time to start a new chapter. One that began not with loss, but with the possibility of found family and second chances. A week into their stay, as Mary grew stronger and baby Ezra began to thrive, Sarah was helping to organize Ezra's few belongings when she discovered something that stopped her cold. Tucked between the pages of an old medical textbook was a pressed flower, perfectly preserved despite its obvious age. The delicate purple petals were almost translucent, mounted carefully on a piece of paper that bore a woman's handwriting. "For my dearest husband, who heals bodies and souls alike. All my love, Margaret." Sarah held the flower up to the window, where the afternoon light made it glow like stained glass. When she turned around, she found Ezra watching her with an expression of such raw vulnerability that she almost put the flower back without saying anything. "She gave this to you," Sarah said gently. It wasn't a question. Ezra nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it was thick with emotion he'd kept buried for too long. "It was a forget-me-not from her garden. She pressed it in her Bible and gave it to me the day I left for the war. Said it would remind me that some things are worth coming home to." "But you did come home," Sarah said, confusion evident in her voice. "Too late," Ezra whispered. 2 months too late. Mary, who'd been listening from the bed while nursing baby Ezra, spoke up quietly. "Tell us about her." "About them both." Ezra took the pressed flower from Sarah's hands, holding it with the reverence reserved for sacred relics. As he spoke, his voice took on a quality Sarah had never heard before, tender, full of love and loss in equal measure. Margaret taught at the schoolhouse in our town. Prettiest woman I'd ever seen, and smart as a whip. She could recite poetry by heart and solve mathematical equations that made my head spin. But what I loved most was the way she saw good in everyone, even people who'd given up on themselves. He settled into his chair by the fire, still holding the flower. "When I told her I was going to study medicine, she said it was perfect because I already had a healer's heart." She used to sit with me while I practiced my sutures on pieces of leather, never once complaining about the smell or the mess. Just believed in me, completely and without question. Sarah curled up on the floor beside his chair, drawn in by the warmth in his voice when he spoke of his wife. "How did you meet her?" "Broke my arm falling out of a tree when I was 22, Ezra chuckled, though tears were evident in his eyes. "She was walking home from school and found me lying there like a fool, cursing at the sky. Instead of laughing at me, she helped me back to town and stayed with me while the doctor set the bone. Brought me books to read while it healed, came by every day to check on me. By the time the cast came off, I was head over heels in love. And Thomas?" Mary asked softly. Ezra's face transformed when he spoke of his son, grief and joy warring in his features. Thomas was everything good about both of us. Had his mother's curiosity and my stubborn streak, which meant he was always getting into some kind of mischief. He'd follow me around when I made house calls, carrying my bag and asking 1,000 questions about everything he saw. He used to tell people he was going to be a doctor, soldier, explorer, teacher when he grew up. The pressed flower trembled in Ezra's hands as he continued. "The morning I left for the war, Thomas gave me this little wooden horse he'd carved. Said it was magic and would bring me home safe. I carried it through every battle, every surgery, every long night in the field hospitals. But when I got back, his voice broke completely. Sarah reached up and took his free hand, squeezing it gently. They knew you loved them. They knew you were doing important work." "Important work?" Ezra repeated bitterly. "I was off saving strangers while my own family was dying. Margaret wrote me letters every week, but the last ones never reached me. They were already gone by the time I got word to come home. The whole town turned out for their funeral. People whose lives Margaret had touched, children she'd taught. But I wasn't there. I was off playing hero, while the most important people in my world slipped away without me." Mary shifted on the bed, baby Ezra asleep in her arms. "What did you do? After the funeral?" "I tried to stay," Ezra said. "Tried to keep practicing medicine, to honor what Margaret had always said about my calling. But every patient reminded me of the ones I couldn't save. Every success felt hollow when measured against my greatest failure. People would thank me for healing their children, and all I could think about was how I'd failed to heal my own." He looked down at the pressed flower, its purple petals still perfect after all these years. "I lasted about 6 months before I couldn't stand it anymore. Sold everything, bought supplies, and headed west until I found a place where nobody knew my name or my story. Figured if I couldn't save the people who mattered most, at least I could stop pretending to be someone worth saving." The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and baby Ezra's soft breathing. Sarah continued to hold Ezra's hand, while Mary watched with the understanding of someone who knew what it meant to carry impossible burdens. "But you did save us," Sarah said finally. "You brought baby Ezra into the world. You gave us shelter when we had nowhere else to go. Maybe that's what Margaret would have wanted. For you to keep helping people, even if it hurt." Ezra looked at the young girl who'd somehow become so important to him in such a short time. "You sound like her sometimes. Margaret always believed that everything happened for a reason, that God put people in our paths when we needed them most." "Maybe she was right," Mary said quietly. "Maybe we found each other because we all needed something the other could give." As the afternoon light began to fade, Ezra carefully placed the pressed flower back in its resting place among the pages of the medical book. But for the first time in 15 years, he didn't feel the crushing weight of guilt when he thought of Margaret and Thomas. Instead, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: gratitude. Gratitude for the time he'd had with them, for the love they'd shared, and for the chance to honor their memory by caring for this new family that had found its way to his door. The pressed forget-me-not had done its job, reminding him that some things were indeed worth coming home to. And perhaps, just perhaps, home wasn't always a place you returned to. Sometimes it was something you built from scratch with people who needed you as much as you needed them. 10 days had passed since the storm, and Mary was finally strong enough to walk around the cabin without assistance. Baby Ezra was thriving, his cries growing stronger each day, and Sarah had settled into a routine of helping with both the household tasks and her mother's recovery. The cabin had taken on the warm atmosphere of a true home, filled with the sounds of family life that Ezra had thought he'd never experience again. It was while searching for additional blankets in Mary's travel pack that Ezra made the discovery that would change everything. Tucked beneath Sarah's spare clothing and Mary's few personal belongings was a folded piece of paper that felt different from the usual letters or documents a traveling family might carry. When he unfolded it, his blood ran cold. The wanted poster was worn from handling but still clearly legible. The face staring back at him was older and harder than Sarah's, but the family resemblance was unmistakable. The same eyes, the same stubborn set of the jaw. Wanted for murder and armed robbery, the poster declared in bold letters. James Jack Sullivan, 500 reward, dead or alive. Ezra's hands shook as he read the details. Multiple bank robberies across 3 states, a sheriff killed during a botched holdup in Kansas, and a trail of violence that stretched back nearly 2 years. The man described in the poster bore no resemblance to the loving father Sarah spoke of with such devotion. Find what you were looking for. Mary's voice came from directly behind him, and Ezra spun around to find her standing in the doorway, her face pale, but her eyes steady. She'd seen what he held, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. "Mary," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Sarah doesn't know," she said quickly, glancing toward the door where her daughter was outside gathering firewood. "She thinks her father is a businessman who went ahead to Oregon to buy land. She thinks we're going to join him for a new start." Ezra looked down at the poster again, studying the hard features of Jack Sullivan. "But you know the truth." "I've known since the beginning," Mary said, moving to sit heavily in the chair by the fire. "Jack wasn't always like this. When I married him, he was a good man, hard-working, devoted to his family. But the war changed him, same as it changed a lot of men. When he came back, he was angry all the time, drinking too much, making bad choices. So you decided to run." Mary's laugh was bitter. "I decided to survive. Jack got involved with some bad people after the war, men who saw his anger and his desperation and used it for their own purposes. By the time I realized how far he'd fallen, it was too late to pull him back." Ezra folded the poster carefully, his mind racing. "The bounty hunters. They'll be looking for you." "For Sarah, we never used our real names on the trail," Mary said. "Called ourselves the Harrises, paid cash for everything, avoided the main routes. I thought if we could just get to Oregon, maybe disappear into one of the logging camps or mining towns, we could start over where nobody would think to look. But the baby changed everything. The baby changed everything," she agreed. "I couldn't travel in that condition. Couldn't risk giving birth on the trail with no help. When the storm hit, I knew we were out of options." Sarah's voice drifted in from outside, singing softly to herself as she worked. The sound was so innocent, so completely unaware of the dangerous truth about her father, that Ezra felt his heart break a little. "She loves him," Mary continued, following his gaze toward the door. "In her mind, he's still the man who taught her to ride horses and carved wooden animals for her birthday. She doesn't know about the drinking, the anger, the things he did after the war. I've been protecting her from the truth for 2 years." Ezra looked at the wanted poster again, studying the reward amount. $500 was enough to set a man up for life on the frontier, enough to make even honest people consider turning in a family for the bounty. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "You could have kept quiet, waited until you were strong enough to travel, and I never would have known." Mary met his eyes directly, her gaze steady despite the fear he could see lurking beneath the surface. "Because you've been honest with us. You've shared your pain, your loss, your secrets. I couldn't keep lying to a man who saved my life and my son's life. And because—" she paused, her voice growing softer, "because I trust you." The weight of her trust settled on Ezra's shoulders like a mantle. Here was a woman who'd spent 2 years running from the law, protecting her daughter from a terrible truth. And she'd chosen to place her family's fate in the hands of a mountain hermit she'd known for barely 10 days. "Mary," he said carefully, "harboring fugitives makes me an accessory. If the law finds you here, I know, she interrupted. I know what I'm asking. If you want us to leave, if you want to turn us in, I'll understand. The reward money could set you up for years. Ezra looked at the poster one more time, then walked to the fireplace and tossed it into the flames. The paper caught quickly, curling and blackening until Jack Sullivan's face disappeared entirely. What reward? He said simply. Mary's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she couldn't speak. When she finally found her voice, it was barely a whisper. Thank you. We're family now, Ezra said, the words feeling strange, but right on his tongue. Family protects each other no matter what. The door opened then, and Sarah came in carrying an armload of firewood, her cheeks red from the cold and her eyes bright with the simple pleasure of being useful. She looked between Ezra and her mother, sensing the tension in the air, but not understanding its source. Is everything all right? She asked, setting down the wood and moving to check on baby Ezra, who was sleeping peacefully in his makeshift cradle. Everything's fine. Sweetheart, Mary said, her voice steady, despite the tears on her cheeks. Ezra and I were just talking about the future. Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her young face. I've been thinking about that too. When we get to Oregon, when we find Papa, maybe Ezra could come with us. We could all be a family together. The innocence in her voice was heartbreaking, and Ezra saw Mary's face crumple slightly at the mention of her husband. But she recovered quickly, reaching out to stroke her daughter's hair. Maybe, sweetheart, she said. We'll have to see what the future brings. As Sarah busied herself with tending the fire, Ezra caught Mary's eye and nodded slightly. Whatever came next, whatever dangers they might face, they would face them together. The wanted poster was gone, reduced to ash and memory. But the threats it represented were still out there somewhere. Jack Sullivan might be Sarah's father, but Ezra was becoming something more important. He was becoming the man who would protect her from the truth about what her father had become, and the man who would stand between his chosen family and anyone who tried to harm them. The transformation was complete. The hermit was gone, replaced by a protector, a father, a man willing to risk everything for the people he'd learned to love. 3 weeks after the storm, life in the cabin had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Mary had recovered completely from the birth, and baby Ezra was growing stronger each day, his cries more robust and his periods of wakefulness longer. Sarah had taken to helping Ezra with his daily tasks, learning to split kindling and tend his small vegetable garden with the eagerness of someone who'd found a purpose. But beneath the surface calm, Ezra was preparing for war. He'd started the preparations subtly, checking his old army rifle each morning, while Sarah was busy with the baby and Mary was resting. The weapon had been carefully maintained during his years of exile, more from habit than expectation of use. But now he cleaned it with the methodical precision of a soldier who knew his life might depend on its reliability. The rifle was a Springfield model 1861, the same type he'd carried during the war. 45 years old now, but still deadly accurate in the right hands. He'd kept a modest supply of ammunition, enough for hunting and protection, but not enough for a prolonged fight. That would have to do, if trouble came. It would likely come fast and decisive. You're worried about something, Mary observed one morning, as she watched him checking the rifle's action for the 3rd time that week. Sarah was outside playing with the baby in the morning sunshine, their laughter drifting through the open door like a promise of normalcy they all desperately wanted to believe in. I'm being careful, Ezra replied. But Mary's knowing look told him she wasn't fooled by his casual tone. It's been 3 weeks, she said quietly. If bounty hunters were tracking us, wouldn't they have found us by now? Ezra set the rifle aside and turned to face her. Maybe. Or maybe they're waiting for better weather to search the high country. Maybe they've been checking every cabin, every settlement, working their way systematically through the territory. Patient hunters catch the biggest prey. Mary was quiet for a moment, watching her daughter spin in circles with baby Ezra in her arms, both of them laughing at some private joke. I've been thinking, she said finally, about what happens next. We can't stay here forever hiding from the world. Why not? Ezra asked, and he was surprised by how much he meant it. The thought of this makeshift family leaving, of returning to his solitary existence, filled him with a dread he hadn't expected, because Sarah deserves better than a life spent looking over her shoulder, Mary replied. She deserves to go to school, to make friends, to grow up somewhere she can put down roots. And because, she paused, her voice growing softer, because you deserve better than to become a fugitive for our sake. I made my choice when I burned that poster, Ezra said firmly. Whatever comes next, we face it together. As if summoned by his words, Sarah came running inside, her face flushed with excitement and something that looked like fear. There are men coming, she announced breathlessly. 3 of them on horseback. They're still about a mile down the trail, but they're heading this way. Ezra was moving before she finished speaking, grabbing the rifle and checking to make sure it was loaded. Mary, take the baby and Sarah to the back room. There's a loose board in the floor near the corner. Lift it up, and you'll find a space where you can hide. I'm not hiding while you face them alone, Mary said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. You are if you want your children to live through this, Ezra replied, his tone brooking no argument. If these are just travelers looking for shelter, I'll invite them in for coffee. If they're bounty hunters. He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Sarah grabbed her mother's arm, her young face suddenly looking far too mature. Mama, what if it's Papa? What if he came looking for us? Mary's face went white at the possibility. Jack Sullivan, wanted dead or alive, riding up to the cabin where his wife and daughter had found safety. It was a nightmare scenario that could end only in tragedy. It won't be him, Mary said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. Your father doesn't know where we are, unless someone told him, Ezra muttered, positioning himself by the window where he could watch the approaching riders. Unless someone saw you on the trail before the storm and word got back to him. Through the trees, he could make out the distant figures more clearly now. 3 men on horseback, moving with the steady purpose of people who knew exactly where they were going. They weren't the random wanderers of the frontier. These men had a destination in mind. Sarah, Ezra said, without turning from the window, I need you to do something very important for me. Take your mother and the baby to the hiding place, and no matter what you hear out here, you don't come out until I tell you it's safe. Do you understand? But what if... No what ifs, Ezra interrupted, finally turning to look at her. I need you to be brave now, braver than you've ever been. Can you do that for me? Sarah nodded, tears starting to track down her cheeks. Are you going to be all right? Ezra managed a smile, though his heart was pounding with the familiar rhythm of pre-battle anxiety. I'm a hard man to kill, little one. I didn't survive the war just to let some bounty hunters take away my family. The word family hung in the air between them, and he saw something flicker in both Mary's and Sarah's eyes. Surprise, gratitude, love. They were his family now, in every way that mattered, and he'd be damned if he was going to let anyone take them away. Go, he said gently. Hide, and trust me to handle this. Mary gathered baby Ezra close to her chest, the infant sensing the tension and beginning to fuss. As she moved toward the back room, she paused beside Ezra, reaching up to touch his weathered cheek with gentle fingers. Whatever happens, she whispered, thank you. For everything. Nothing's going to happen, Ezra replied, though they both knew it might be a lie. I'll see you in a few minutes, and we'll have a good laugh about how worried we were over nothing. As Mary and Sarah disappeared into the back room, Ezra heard the soft sound of the floorboard being lifted and then carefully replaced. His family was as safe as he could make them. Now it was time to face whatever was coming down the mountain trail. The riders were close enough now that he could see individual faces. 3 men, heavily armed, with the hard look of professionals who made their living through violence. The lead rider was older, maybe 50, with grey streaks in his beard and the kind of scars that spoke of a lifetime spent on the wrong side of the law. The other 2 were younger, but no less dangerous looking, bounty hunters without question. And from the way they were riding straight toward his cabin, without hesitation, they knew exactly what they were looking for. Ezra checked his rifle one more time. ensuring the action was smooth and the sight was clear. 43 years old, and he was about to fight for his family again, only this time it wasn't the union he was protecting, but something far more precious and personal. The sound of hoofbeats was getting closer, and with it came the weight of a decision that would determine whether the fragile happiness he'd found in this remote cabin would survive the next few minutes. He'd spent 15 years running from his past, but there was nowhere left to run. It was time to make his stand. The riders came to a stop about 30 yards from the cabin, close enough for conversation, but far enough to make a quick escape if necessary. Ezra stood in his doorway, rifle held casually but ready, projecting the calm authority of a man who'd faced down worse threats than 3 bounty hunters on horseback. "Morning," called the lead rider, his voice carrying the artificial friendliness of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through a combination of charm and intimidation. "Beautiful country up here. Must get lonely, though, living so far from civilization." "I like the quiet," Ezra replied evenly. "What brings you gentlemen to my mountain?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Fletcher. These are my associates, Mills and Garrett. We're looking for some folks who might have passed through here a few weeks back. A woman and her daughter, traveling with some urgency due to the woman's condition." From inside the cabin came the faint sound of baby Ezra beginning to cry, muffled by the floorboards, but still audible to anyone listening carefully. Fletcher's smile widened at the sound. "Seems like you might have had visitors recently," he observed. "Mind if we come in and warm up? It's been a cold ride up from the valley." "I mind," Ezra said simply. "This is private property, and you gentlemen haven't stated your business clearly enough for my liking." Mills, the younger of the 2 associates, shifted in his saddle and let his hand drift toward the pistol on his hip. "Maybe you didn't hear Fletcher clear enough, old man. We're looking for some people, and it sounds like they might be inside your cabin right now." "What I hear," Ezra replied, not moving from his position in the doorway, "is 3 armed strangers making implied threats on my property. In these parts, that gives me legal right to defend myself and my home." Fletcher held up a hand to forestall his more aggressive companion. "Now let's all stay calm here. Nobody's making threats. We're just asking questions about some fugitives from justice, dangerous criminals who might have put innocent folks like yourself in harm's way." He reached slowly into his coat and produced a folded paper, which he held up for Ezra to see. Even at 30 yards, Ezra could make out enough details to know it was another wanted poster, probably the same one he'd burned weeks ago. "Jack Sullivan," Fletcher continued, "wanted for murder and armed robbery. Last seen in Kansas with his wife Mary and daughter Sarah. There's a substantial reward for information leading to their capture." "Never heard of them," Ezra lied smoothly. "And I haven't seen any travelers up here since before the big storm 3 weeks ago." The baby's crying was getting louder now, and Ezra saw Garrett, the 3rd bounty hunter, cock his head like a hunting dog picking up a scent. "That baby sounds awfully young," Garrett observed. "Awful coincidence. You having a newborn when we're looking for a woman who would have been ready to give birth right around the time of that storm you mentioned." Fletcher's pretense of friendliness was beginning to slip. "Here's what we're thinking, friend. We think Mary Sullivan and her daughter took shelter in your cabin during that storm. We think she gave birth here, and we think they're still here now, hiding while you try to protect them." "Think whatever you want," Ezra replied. "Doesn't change the fact that you're trespassing. The law gives us authority to search any dwelling where we have reasonable suspicion that our quarry might be hiding," Fletcher said, his voice hardening. "And crying baby constitutes reasonable suspicion in my book." As if on cue, the infant's cries suddenly stopped. Mary had managed to quiet him, but the damage was done. All 3 bounty hunters had heard enough to convince them that their search was over. "Tell you what," Fletcher said, drawing his pistol with practiced ease. "You step aside peaceful-like, let us take the woman and girl, and there doesn't have to be any trouble. Hell, we'll even cut you in for a piece of the reward. $500 split 4 ways is still good money." Mills and Garrett drew their weapons as well, creating a deadly triangle of gun barrels, all pointed at Ezra's position in the doorway. Inside the cabin, the silence stretched tight as a bowstring, Mary and Sarah listening from their hiding place. Baby Ezra quiet in his mother's arms, everyone waiting for the moment that would determine their fate. "Last chance, old man," Fletcher warned. "Step aside or we'll step over your body." "Makes no difference to us." Ezra looked at the 3 armed men arrayed against him, calculated angles and distances and possibilities with the cold precision of a veteran soldier. The odds were terrible, 3 to 1, caught in the open doorway with limited cover. But behind him, hidden beneath the floorboards, was everything that mattered to him now. He thought of Margaret's pressed flower, of little Thomas's wooden soldier now resting in baby Ezra's tiny hands, of Sarah's trusting smile and Mary's quiet courage. Some things were worth dying for, and some fights had to be fought regardless of the odds. "Gentlemen," Ezra said, raising his rifle to his shoulder with fluid motion, "I believe you've overstayed your welcome." The first shot came from Fletcher's pistol, the bullet splintering the doorframe inches from Ezra's head. But the mountain man was already moving, dropping to one knee and returning fire with the precision of a marksman who'd learned his trade in the crucible of war. The Springfield's report echoed across the mountain valley like thunder, and Fletcher pitched backward from his saddle with a cry of pain and surprise. Mills and Garrett scattered, their horses rearing and plunging as the animals reacted to the gunfire. Mills managed to stay mounted, wheeling his horse behind a large pine tree for cover, while Garrett hit the ground running and dove behind a fallen log 20 yards to the left. Ezra rolled sideways through his doorway and into the cabin, bullets chewing up the wooden planks where he'd been standing moments before. His military training kicked in like muscle memory. Assess the situation, identify cover, return fire, move to better position. The years melted away, and he was Captain Blackwood again, fighting for the lives of people who depended on him. 3 men, pistols and rifles, he called softly toward the back room, knowing Mary and Sarah needed to understand what they were facing. "Stay down, stay quiet, and trust me to handle this." Through the window, he could see Mills trying to maneuver for a better angle on the cabin. The bounty hunter was good, patient, professional, not letting anger override tactics. But Ezra had advantages the younger man couldn't know about. He'd spent 15 years studying every approach to this cabin, every tree and rock that could provide cover, every angle of attack an enemy might use. A rifle shot from Garrett's position sent splinters flying from the window frame. The man was trying to pin Ezra down while Mills worked his way closer. Classic tactics, but predictable. Ezra counted to 3, then rose just high enough to snap off a shot toward the fallen log. He didn't expect to hit anything, but the bullet kicked up dirt and bark close enough to make Garrett flinch and hesitate. That moment of hesitation was all Ezra needed. He sprinted across the cabin to the opposite window, arriving just as Mills emerged from behind his tree, pistol raised. The bounty hunter's eyes went wide as he realized he'd been outmaneuvered, but Ezra's rifle was already speaking. Mills tumbled from his horse with a scream, clutching his shoulder as he hit the ground hard. 2 down, 1 to go. But Fletcher was still moving behind his downed horse, not as badly wounded as Ezra had hoped. The man was tough. Ezra had to give him that. A lesser opponent would have stayed down after taking a rifle bullet, but Fletcher was already working his way toward better cover, using his horse's body as a shield. "Give it up, old man!" Garrett shouted from behind his log. "Fletcher's sent for more men. You're just delaying the inevitable." It was probably a bluff, but Ezra couldn't be certain. He needed to end this quickly before the situation became even more complicated. Baby Ezra had started crying again, his wails adding urgency to an already desperate situation. Ezra made his decision. Instead of staying defensively positioned in the cabin, he kicked open the back door and slipped outside, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain to work his way around behind Garrett's position. The bounty hunter was focused on the front of the cabin, watching for movement in the windows. Unaware that his quarry had become the hunter, the Springfield was heavy in Ezra's hands as he crept through the pine trees, his boots silent on the carpet of fallen needles. 43 years old, and his joints ached from the crawling and scrambling, but his hands were steady and his mind was clear. This was what he'd been trained for, what he'd done in a dozen different battles across the South. He came up behind Garrett like a ghost, the rifle barrel touching the back of the bounty hunter's neck before the man knew he was there. "Drop the gun," Ezra said quietly. "Do it now or join your friend Fletcher in whatever comes after." Garrett's rifle fell from nerveless fingers, clattering against the fallen log. His hands came up slowly, shaking with the realization of how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. "Easy now," he whispered. "No need for more killing. We can work something out. The only thing we're working out is how you're going to ride down this mountain and forget you ever heard the name Sullivan," Ezra replied. "You're going to collect your wounded friends and you're going to disappear. If I ever see any of you again, if I ever hear that bounty hunters are asking questions about this cabin, I'll finish what we started here today." From the cabin came Mary's voice, calling his name with relief and concern. She'd heard the shooting stop and was desperate to know if he was safe. Sarah's voice joined hers, and even baby Ezra seemed to sense that the immediate danger had passed. "Go," Ezra told Garrett, stepping back but keeping the rifle trained on him. "Help your friends and get off my mountain. And remember, some families are worth more than any reward." As the defeated bounty hunter scrambled to assist his wounded companions, Ezra felt the transformation complete itself. The hermit was truly gone now, replaced by something fiercer and more protective. He was a father again, a defender, a man willing to kill or die for the people he loved. The mountain was theirs, and anyone who threatened his family would have to go through him first. The sound of the bounty hunter's horses fading into the distance marked the end of more than just a confrontation. It marked the beginning of a new chapter for the unlikely family that had found each other in a mountain storm. Ezra stood in the doorway of his cabin, rifle still in his hands, watching until the last trace of their pursuers disappeared down the trail before finally allowing himself to breathe freely. "Ezra?" Mary's voice came from inside the cabin, tentative but hopeful. "It's over," he called back. "You can come out now." The floorboard creaked as Mary and Sarah emerged from their hiding place, baby Ezra still cradled protectively in his mother's arms. Sarah ran to Ezra immediately, throwing her arms around his waist, with the fierce gratitude of someone who'd just watched her world nearly disappear. "I thought they were going to kill you," she whispered against his chest, tears dampening his shirt. "Takes more than 3 bounty hunters to finish off this old mountain goat," Ezra replied gently, setting the rifle aside so he could properly return her embrace. "Besides, I had something worth fighting for." Mary approached more slowly, her eyes taking in the splintered doorframe and broken window glass, evidence of how close they'd all come to tragedy. "Are they really gone? For good?" "They won't be back," Ezra said with certainty. "Word will spread among their kind that this mountain isn't worth the trouble. Bounty hunters are businessmen first. They'll find easier prey." As if to emphasize the return of peace, baby Ezra chose that moment to let out a contented gurgle, his tiny fist working free of his blanket to wave in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through the cabin's windows. The sight of him, so innocent and unaware of the danger that had just passed, filled Ezra with a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, pulling back to look up at Ezra's weathered face. "Do we have to keep running?" Mary and Ezra exchanged a look over Sarah's head, a silent communication that spoke of shared understanding and mutual respect. They both knew that Jack Sullivan was still out there somewhere, still wanted by the law, still a potential threat to his family's safety. But they also knew that some battles were worth fighting, and some sanctuaries were worth defending. "I've been thinking about that," Ezra said, settling into his chair by the fireplace with Sarah still close beside him. "This mountain is big enough for all of us, isolated enough to keep us safe, and I've got enough supplies and knowledge to last us through any number of winters." "You mean We can stay." Sarah's voice was filled with wonder, as if she'd hardly dared to hope for such a possibility. "If that's what you want," Ezra replied. "This cabin's been too quiet for too long anyway. Could use the sound of children playing, of family dinners, of bedtime stories and morning laughter." Mary settled into the chair across from him, baby Ezra nursing contentedly in her arms. "What about Sarah's education? She's bright. She deserves the chance to learn, to grow up with other children her age." "I've got books," Ezra said. "Medical texts, literature, mathematics, history, and there's a whole world of knowledge in these mountains for someone willing to learn. Botany, astronomy, practical skills that most children never get the chance to discover. We'll make our own school, our own community." As they talked, planning a future that none of them had imagined possible just hours earlier, Sarah noticed something on the mantel that hadn't been there before. Beside the hand-carved cross was a piece of paper, official-looking despite being written in Ezra's careful script. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to the document. Ezra smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered features and made him look years younger. "That's your brother's birth certificate. Official record that Ezra James Sullivan was born in this cabin on the 15th day of February, 1847, to Mary Sullivan and—" He paused, meeting Mary's eyes. "To parents who love him very much." Mary's eyes filled with tears as she understood the gesture. By documenting the birth officially, Ezra was giving baby Ezra something precious, a legal identity that had nothing to do with wanted posters or bounty hunters. A clean start in a world that could be harsh on families with complicated pasts. "Ezra James Sullivan," Sarah repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "I like it. It sounds strong." "Strong names for strong people," Ezra agreed. "And speaking of strong people, I have something for both of you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out two small objects, wooden figures carved with the same careful precision as Thomas's toy soldier. One was a horse, perfectly detailed down to the flowing mane and muscled haunches. The other was a woman in a long dress, her face serene and kind. "I've been working on these in the evenings," he explained, handing the horse to Sarah and the woman to Mary. "Figured if we're going to be a family, we should all have something to remember this time by." Sarah turned the wooden horse over in her hands, marveling at the craftsmanship. "It's beautiful. Did you make this for me?" "I made it because you've taught an old man that it's possible to care about something again," Ezra replied. "Because you've shown me that family isn't just about blood, it's about choice, and commitment, and love." As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the cabin settled into the peaceful rhythm that had become their evening routine. Mary rocked baby Ezra by the fire, humming a lullaby that seemed to blend with the whisper of wind through the pines. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully arranging her new wooden horse alongside baby Ezra's toy soldier, creating elaborate stories about their adventures. Ezra watched them all with a contentment he'd thought lost forever. The wanted poster was ashes in his fireplace, the bounty hunters were gone, and his family was safe. More than that, they were home, not because of the cabin's walls or the mountain's isolation, but because they'd chosen each other. "Tell me about tomorrow," Sarah said suddenly, looking up from her toys. "What will we do tomorrow? And the day after that, and the day after that?" "Tomorrow, we'll start building you a proper room," Ezra replied. "Can't have a growing girl sleeping in a corner forever. And we'll begin your lessons, reading, writing, arithmetic, and anything else you want to learn. And the day after that, we'll check the snares, tend the garden, maybe start planning for next winter. There's a lot of work involved in making a life up here, but it's good work, honest work. And the day after that?" Mary laughed softly at her daughter's endless curiosity. "The day after that and every day after we'll be together. We'll be a family," Sarah nodded, satisfied with that answer. She picked up the wooden horse and held it up to catch the firelight. "Do you think Papa will ever find us?" The question hung in the air for a moment, carrying weight and complexity that went far beyond its simple words. Mary and Ezra exchanged another look, this one tinged with sadness for the man Jack Sullivan might have been. and determination to protect the family they'd become. If he does, Ezra said finally, we'll deal with that when it happens. But until then, we focus on what we can control, taking care of each other, building something good and lasting, and making sure baby Ezra grows up knowing he's loved and wanted. As if responding to his name, the infant stirred in Mary's arms, his tiny eyes opening to focus on the faces surrounding him. In the firelight, his features seemed to blend the best of everyone who'd claimed him. Mary's gentle eyes, Sarah's determined chin, and something indefinable that spoke of the mountain man who'd brought him safely into the world. "Look at that," Sarah whispered in wonder. "He's looking right at us. Like he knows we're his family." "Of course he knows," Mary said softly. "Family isn't something you learn, it's something you feel. And this little one has never known anything but love and protection." The birth certificate on the mantel caught the firelight, its official language unable to capture the full story of how baby Ezra James Sullivan had come to be born in a mountain cabin during a blizzard, delivered by a hermit who'd found his way back to the world through an act of compassion. But it would stand as proof that some beginnings, however unlikely, could lead to the most extraordinary of families. Outside, the mountain night settled around the cabin like a protective embrace. The same peaks that had once represented isolation now stood as guardians, sheltering the family within from whatever storms might come. And inside, by the warmth of the fire, 4 people who had found each other against all odds continued the ancient human tradition of making a home wherever love took root. The last entry in Ezra's journal, written weeks later in his careful script, would capture the transformation completely. "Today I realized that home isn't a place you return to. It's a place you create with people who choose to stay." Margaret was right about love having nowhere to go when someone dies. But she was also right about something else. Love finds a way to grow again, even in the most unexpected places, with the most unexpected people. "My family is sleeping peacefully tonight, and tomorrow will begin another day of the life we've built together. Some storms bring destruction, but others, like the blizzard that brought Mary and Sarah to my door, bring exactly what we need, when we need it most." The wooden cross on the mantel seemed to glow in the firelight, no longer a symbol of loss, but of the faith required to open one's heart to new possibilities. And beside it, the birth certificate stood as testament to the truth that had taken Ezra Blackwood 43 years to learn. The best families are often the ones we choose, and the greatest love stories are written, not in romance, but in the daily acts of caring for those who need us most.